duties. In the 18th century, David Hume objected to the way authors on morality shifted from statements connected by is or is not to others connected by ought or ought not, which he said express a new relation. To Hume it seemed inconceivable that ought relationships were deducible from is ones, which he saw as entirely different. This is commonly interpreted to mean we can't infer what we morally ought to do from purely factual premises. We can't derive an ought from an is. But further reading gives a different emphasis. Here's what Hume says about willful murder. The vice entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. You'll never find it till you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation which arises in you towards this action. Here is a matter of fact, but 'tis the object of feeling. It lies in yourself, not in the object. In other words, evil isn't a feature of murder, but a judgment arising from sentiment. When Hume objects to the shift from is to ought, he's criticising those who mistake their own feelings about murder for intrinsic qualities of murder, echoing the aforementioned error of projecting one's own attitude onto the object of that attitude. Of course, whatever Hume's original meaning, the idea that we can't derive moral oughts from factual is statements has spawned a great deal of debate in our own time. But is the so-called is-ought problem really a problem? All it's saying is that moral obligations aren't deducible purely from non-moral facts. And this seems quite true if moral obligations involve emotional elements. I don't like pain. My dislike of pain isn't arbitrary. I'm biologically biased to dislike it. Indeed, the aversive quality of pain protects us by prompting our retreat from harmful stimuli. Knowing also that I've no valid basis for thinking my comfort is uniquely important, if I want others not to hurt me, then to avoid hypocrisy, this obliges me not to hurt them. This obligation isn't unconditional. It arises largely from biologically influenced preferences. Some say preference has no role in our morality. After all, rapists like raping, but we don't say they ought to rape. But of course that's misleading. Morality has never meant doing whatever you prefer, no matter who it hurts. Part of morality's essence is considering our impact on others, and asking why rapists shouldn't do what they prefer completely ignores the preference of the victim. No one's saying all preferences are morally relevant, but some are. We have numerous moral prohibitions about inflicting pain. That our dislike of pain is a preference doesn't diminish its relevance. When we dissect any moral obligation, we always find some element of preference, even if it's a preference largely determined by biology. As Mackey notes, for any argument that supports an evaluative conclusion, where this conclusion has some action-guiding force that's not contingent upon desires or purposes or chosen ends, somewhere in the input to this argument there will be something which cannot be objectively validated, some premise which is not capable of being simply true, or some form of argument which is not valid as a matter of general logic, whose authority or cogency is not objective. Craig claims that if God does not exist, there's no ground for objective moral duties because there's no moral lawgiver, the implication being that a lawgiver could provide that ground. But this is false. Lawgivers are still subjective beings, and their presence doesn't guarantee objectivity. Even if a divine lawgiver required certain duties of us, all that would be necessarily true is that it required duties of us. It wouldn't follow that the duties were therefore objectively good or grounded. Craig thinks he can achieve objective grounding by making use of Anselm of Canterbury's notion of a greatest conceivable being. According to Anselm's ontological argument, one can understand what's meant by a greatest conceivable being, so such a being can exist at least in thought. But if it exists only in thought, one can think of a greater being, existing in thought and reality. Therefore, Anselm insists, if one claims to be able to conceive of a greatest being, without ascribing to it real existence, one is contradicting oneself. He later inflates this being to one not only that exists, but whose non-existence is inconceivable. Of the well-known flaws in this argument, perhaps the most basic, is that even if person A has in her mind a concept of a greatest conceivable being, no logic requires her concept to correspond with reality. As Kant points out, whatever and however much our concept of an object may contain, we must go outside the concept if we're to attribute the object with existence. No ontological argument establishes that there must be a God, that this God must have an essential nature, or that that essential nature must be good, which leaves Craig's claim to objective grounding no more than the unsupported assertion of a God and of the qualities Craig wants it to have to make his moral case. We value generosity, compassion and fairness because we experience and appreciate their positive effects. When they're proclaimed as divine qualities, this isn't because anyone's observed such qualities in a god. No god has yet been established to exist, let alone one whose nature we can study. All that's happening is that qualities we've already judged independently to have value are being ascribed to an entity declared to exist and to be good by definition. If we want to imagine an idealized being as a way of developing some basic principles of conduct, the most appropriate model would be something with human biology. Rooting morality in a being beyond our comprehension only pushes morality beyond our comprehension. It's even worse when what we choose as a model is a god of ancient scripture, depicted violating moral principles we hold to be most basic. When we tell ourselves there's an all-powerful entity that can do this, yet still be morally perfect, we create the very conditions that, far from leading us to moral truth, guarantee our moral confusion. Even if a god created our universe, nothing about the act or power of grand creation requires moral perfection. And even if our universe was created by a god that was somehow intrinsically good, no logic would require that being still to exist. Imagine such a god existed yesterday but destroyed itself today. Would torture suddenly stop being a moral issue? If so, this god clearly couldn't have embodied values of enduring relevance, severing any connection with objective moral value. If not, we're admitting the god doesn't need to exist, destroying this moral argument's conclusion. There'd be equally overwhelming problems with claiming that moral values and duties are transcendental in nature and therefore require a supernatural creator. As soon as we require things to be imbued supernaturally with goodness, badness or oughtness, as soon as we allow the supernatural to feature in any of our explanations, the idea of a single supreme deity becomes just one of countless unknowable, untestable concepts, all with their own ad hoc justifications. In a video I made with Theremin Trees called Betting on Infinity, we look at what those floodgates let in. In this case, transcendental values and duties could just as easily be the creation of a group of supernatural experimenters, arbitrarily making things good and bad, so as to study the effect on animal behaviour. If moral values and duties were the kinds of things that had to be created supernaturally, this alone would count against their objective validity. A perennial problem with arguments for divine existence is that even if they were valid, they still wouldn't provide a logical pathway to the God of any particular religion or scripture. Reviewing this moral argument, the implication of premise 1 that the existence and only the existence of one God could ground moral objectivity is not established. Not only do objective values and duties lack necessary support, we've good reason to reject those concepts as incoherent, leaving premise 2 and therefore the conclusion undemonstrated. This moral argument does not establish the existence of any God. The motive for objectifying moral values and duties is understandable. As Mackey notes, since we need morality to regulate interpersonal relations, often against people's natural inclinations, we therefore want our moral judgments to be authoritative, and many think only objectivity can achieve this authority. In the words of Thomas Nagel, there's a tendency to seek an objective account of everything before admitting its reality. But often what appears to a more subjective point of view cannot be accounted for in this way. The common misconception that if morality isn't entirely objective, it's subjective and therefore only opinion or arbitrary, has obscured and hijacked much of the discourse on the subject and should be discarded. In video 4, building on themes in previous videos, I'll be discussing the origins and components of a more rounded morality, relevant to theists and non-believers alike, and this will include a look at utility, rules and consequences.